All right. Welcome back to another episode in this special series about how to run your law firm in 2025. And for this episode and the next one, maybe two, we'll see how long we talk about it, is the one everybody's been waiting for, including Lauren and I, and that is technology. Woohoo, technology. And we're going to start with hardware. And at first, we're kind of like, well, okay, so you have a computer and you have a monitor and a mouse and a keyboard, and like, what is there to talk about hardware? But it turns out I think that there's actually a lot to talk about hardware, including the hardware you start out with, and maybe what you have is good enough, and then how we started out, and then what we've acquired and how we've improved our setup, and why things matter and why some hardware maybe doesn't matter. Because everybody kind of wants to, well, not everybody, but many of us, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably want to have cool technology. Um, but maybe it's not necessary and maybe it is. So we'll start, Lauren, curious to know, like, when you got started, did you just use that laptop you had in law school because you went solo right away? Like, what was your hardware setup like then? And how did it get to where it is now?
You're absolutely right. So I just used what I had in law school. So I think I had a MacBook Air at the time because I was going to class all the time. So I wanted the lightest, smallest laptop that I could have. And that's what I started with. And I have had laptops throughout my professional career, even back into high school with. So I just used what I had. I don't even know if I had an external keyboard or mouse at the time, but I did quickly add that on. I did find once I was sitting at a desk pretty routinely every day, I wasn't traveling back and forth to class, that I wanted something a little bit more stationary. So I got an external keyboard and mouse and an external monitor. And then I just ran with my laptop for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years until it kind of crapped out and I needed a new one. What about you? What'd you start with?
Yeah, so since I was starting, I mean, we talked about this, actually two businesses at the time, at least at the time, and I don't know what amount it is now, but I think according to my CPA, I could spend up to $5,000 on like getting a business started, and it's all deductible. You don't have to depreciate for particular assets like you'd sometimes have to for a computer, right? Now, again, no tax advice given on this podcast. Don't rely on that. Talk to your CPA and revisit one of the earlier episodes where we talked about that a little bit more detail. So I actually got the most advanced and souped up M1 Mac Mini at the time, which had been out for actually a couple of years by then. I think it was the late 2020 version, but I was getting it in 2022, in the beginning of 2022, as I was preparing to launch my practice. And so it actually didn't like you might think like it costs a lot of money, but at the time, and a Mac Mini spent easily over $3,000, put everything on there. Um, at the time, to max out the M1 Mac Mini was like $1,500, and it's a lot. It's a lot to spend, but you could easily spend that on a laptop, on like a MacBook Pro. And I also knew I wanted a monitor. And so, like I wanted a nice wide, ultra wide curved monitor. I never had one before, but I had like dabbled with them at friends' places and in particular situations. And so I thought that that would be a good experience for me. And so I didn't want to go the laptop route. And I knew it would be working from home 99% of the time. And I had my Surface Pro that I talked about in the last episode. Even though it was getting a little old and a little sluggish, I could use that on the go, and I was mostly in the cloud, so it didn't really matter. So my on the go setup was fine. So I wanted to get an ultra wide monitor. I knew I had the podcast, and I wanted to increase my production and the quality of all that. So I actually originally built out my studio in my home before I built out my office. I got like a tiny desk that I'm at right now that fits in it's not supposed to be a walk-in closet, but I sit in this closet a lot. And so like that was my original setup. And I knew eventually I was going to have another monitor that connected to the Mac Mini outside my studio in my office. This is the closet in my office at home. So I got a wireless mouse and keyboard so that I could easily just transition from the small desk to the big desk. And now I've been doing that for a couple of years, and it's really nice. So even though you don't necessarily need something crazy to get started, you do maybe want to have a little bit of a vision in mind with how you're going, like how you're like going to be physically practicing law via the technology that we use, via the hardware we use, and think about that and like what your marketing strategy is if you're going to be doing podcasting or content creation. And so I did deliberately plan for a future where I'd maybe have a more advanced tech setup. But in the beginning, it was just Mac Mini so that I could have it for several years, and I did. ultra wide monitor with a mount, wireless mouse and keyboard, and everything else I have is wired except for those two things. And that was it. That was how I got started as far as the tech is concerned. And I had an old Surface Pro X.
I think that's a really good point about how you think you'll work. Because while I am certainly at my desk in my home office pretty frequently, it's probably not in the 90% of the time. It's maybe like 70% of the time. And I knew I wanted to get up and go to the coffee shop once in a while just to have a different environment, or I was going to be meeting clients that wanted me to meet them where they were. And I was happy to do that because that was convenient for them. So I needed something that I could grab and take my computer with me. And when I had the lighter Air, that was super easy. But then, yes, once I got into content creation and video production, it was not churning. I didn't have quite as much power as it needed to. And that was sort of my tipping point to say, all right, this has served me very well. In my experience, Macs have lasted me forever, but I needed something with a little more oomph. So a couple years ago, I invested in a new MacBook Pro, which has all the horsepower that I would need for all of the video and content creation. So it's a much bigger machine. So I don't bring it around as much. But that then did give me the idea, like your Surface, to get an iPad so that if I did want to go have a client meeting or I needed to go to a committee meeting, I could grab that, which was lighter. It didn't have all of the power, but I didn't need the power in that situation. So, really thinking through, how am I going to use this? Where am I going to be? That can really help dictate a good piece of hardware for you. So, you're not overspending or getting overkill for something that you're just not ultimately going to use.
And then for you, you were going to court, I imagine, too.
Exactly. And that's where the iPad actually came in most handy because I think there are some attorneys, and I don't ever think a judge said this to me, but I didn't like hearing the typing like while the court was talking and I'm trying to take notes. So I liked that the iPad had the pencil and I could get an app where I could hand write notes, but then I didn't have to scan them in. They would transcribe automatically. So I saved myself that step, but the iPad was really helpful in court because I needed to have access to my cloud files and I also needed to take notes and I didn't want to do that on a computer.
Yeah, yeah, and now I think in even just in the Notes app on an iPad, you could just handwrite notes now.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, they've integrated that. Yeah, this was a few years ago when they didn't have that feature, but now I think most of those more mobile devices have that available.
Yeah, yeah, and I like how, we're doing enough of these, Lauren, that we could have shout outs to past episodes because we talked about how we pivoted. So now that you're in practice areas that at least I think don't really have much at all to do with court, maybe some probate stuff, but, like, far less frequently you're going to court. Have you started to reevaluate, "Well, now I have different practice areas, maybe I wanna change up my tech setup?"
It hasn't yet. I definitely use my iPad less. So there's a little bit of like, I spent a good amount of money there, not quite using that. I try and find ways to use it, but I am definitely more stationary. So before where it was maybe 50-50 that I was out and about versus in my home office, it's more home office now, but the laptop does just fine. It is bigger and heavier, but I stick it in a backpack and I'm not going around too much. So yeah,
Mhm.
there's less need for technology, but I've still got it, so I'll find a way to use it.
Okay. I'm so glad we're talking about this because I don't know what year your iPad came out and what operating system it can run. But this is kind of a software conversation, but it's also specifically about the hardware. So if you're a Mac user and you have an iPad, there's a feature called Sidecar where your iPad can become an additional monitor to your Mac, even if you're leveraging the maximum amount of additional monitors that you can connect to whether it's any kind of Mac, whether it's a laptop or a desktop style Mac. You could also now use your iPad. I think it's just one iPad. I only have one iPad. um, but like this is a really cool feature. And so sometimes what I'll do is because even though I have two ultra wide monitors, I only am using one at a time. And sometimes it's nice when I'm in my big desk setup to have, and I actually, I got these, not like a energy powered piece of technology, but just an analog piece of technology. Part of my swag are now these like little phone and tablet iPad stands that they fold up. You could put it in your pocket, your purse, your bag, whatever. And so I have a bunch of them now. So I have one at every desk station where I could just like put up my iPad, and if I'm, like, editing a podcast or I'm doing something that kind of requires its own like, unique screen setup, I could just move it down to my iPad, sort of still in my line of sight, but out of the way, and, like, listen to something or have some other app open on the iPad while I'm doing other things on my main ultra-wide monitor. And so I actually use the sidecar feature all the time, and since I have a wireless mouse and keyboard and everything, I can kinda set it up wherever, and if I wanted to work downstairs, but still have access to the power of my Mac Mini upstairs, I could just have the sidecar feature turned on, bring my wireless mouse and keyboard anywhere in my home, and I could work sort of from anywhere. And so that's been, like, a huge unlock, and, well, I'm super happy I got an iPad in 2024.
Oh, that's an awesome feature. I didn't know about that. I'll have to check out. I can't remember how old my iPad is. It's not too old, but it's older than a couple of years. Maybe it was early 2020, so I'll have to see if that feature is in there. And now I'm gonna be like, should I get a new one? If it's not, that's always the problem. I always like the shiny new hardware. But that's a cool idea. And I think that would be so helpful if you just sort of needed a little screen for something, like whether it was a timer, or sometimes I'll just take notes. I'll be talking to a client and I'll just need to write a handwritten note. I honestly write it on my desk because it's glass, but that would be so much nicer to do it on an iPad. So what a great idea.
Oh, well, that's cool. I have a glass desk too. You just, like, write with a marker that you could erase from, like, a glass desk? Like, what are you doing there?
Yeah, just a dry erase marker. You can just I just will take a quick note if a client gives me a date, or I just was talking to somebody and they said their birthday, so I didn't want to like make it obvious that I was writing it down, but I'll just write it down on my desk and then you just erase it. Dry eraser. So cool.
Very cool. Cool. That's like, I mean, that's a hardware, like a hard
Yeah.
surface tech, right? I love the low tech talk too about this. I think that's still really important. So I'm curious to know, did you ever get like an extra monitor? So if you're like you're working from home and you want to see things bigger, or are you still predominantly just leveraging the screen that comes with the laptop?
So I do have an external monitor when I'm working at home. So my laptop is actually closed on the side of my desk and the monitor is hooked up. So I only use the external monitor, and it's a television. It's a Samsung like 24-inch television because I couldn't find a monitor big enough that was a true computer monitor. And
Mhm.
now that TVs, the laptop hooks up with an HDMI cord, just use that. But I do like you, I like a really big screen. I like to have Word clearly open on one side and, Excel. Like I like to have two different windows and not have to be going back and forth. So I wanted something real big.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe then you don't need an iPad as an additional screen, but you might find it's nice to just have a little app open off to the side, right?
I'm going to try it. I'm going to try it. I like it.
Yeah, yeah, sidecar. Okay, and then camera. What are you using for camera?
So I currently have it's an little eye contact camera. It has a light. What I like about it, because I have such a big monitor and I like to have the camera where it's right in front of me, it's not way up high or down low. This one goes on the top of my monitor and then the camera actually swings down on an arm. So when I have it on, I swing it down and it sits in front of my monitor, but it's so tiny it doesn't block things. So I used to have a webcam that would sit on a tripod right in front of my monitor, but I couldn't, and I was constantly like moving around. I couldn't see my screen. This is so skinny. It's not as great of a camera as my other webcam was. Like it was a HD webcam, but I like the convenience of it. And then when I'm not using it, it just flips up and sits up there. So I think that it works pretty well. I think it gives me a good kind of line of sight where the camera's right at my face. Your setup looks amazing, Matthew. So what are you using for your camera? I'm sure it's ultra cool.
It's definitely unique in that I take a lot of tips from like live streaming pros that are content creators, like professionally. Like like they're
It's
I
a
feel like
job.
they've all got a side hustle though, like to that, right? Like they all have a coaching program or a membership program or like all the affiliate links. Like I've definitely used their affiliate links to buy some of these things, right? But I do just want to comment on your setup. I think that's a great example of whatever you're comfortable with and like not having to throw out everything to get something new to make it perfect, which I definitely haven't done either. I've tried to think like, a few years in advance in terms of what I want my setup to be, but I've never like felt like I have to just get rid of everything and make it perfect. is that's really expensive and you don't really need to do it. At the end of the day, we're lawyers. Yes, Lauren and I, we're content creators, right? Like we like making content. So like some of that's important, but at the same time, like you don't need like a 5K camera, like
Right. For
perfectly
Zoom
positioned
meetings. Yes.
like for Zoom court or for
Yeah.
client situations, like it needs to be bare minimum professional. So if you're super fuzzy and you look like a potato, and if you look like me and you have no hair, you might actually look like a potato. But like you don't want that, right? But there's a certain level of professionalism and having the camera positioned in such a way that it's right in front of your face so that you're looking into the camera and maybe you could be looking at a screen too at the same time. That's a really clever way that you've handled that with like flipping, being able to bring the camera down center right in front of you. I have recently done something like that. So previously, I had my ultra wide monitor in my studios on a mount. And so I could kind of position it up and down, angle it however I want, because I try to be super ergonomic. The wireless mouse and keyboard I have are Logitech. It's the Ergo keyboard and the MX Master mouse, and both of those are ergonomically designed for resting your wrists, for how you type. Like it's weird at first because there's like a split in the keyboard and there's just blank space, but it is over time more ergonomic, more natural to rest your hands like that. So I'm all about ergonomics. I even have a footrest, like a little footrest, because I'm sitting in my desk, and I have two. I have one because I don't want to move it, and they're relatively inexpensive. They're like 20 to 30 bucks. And so I've got one in my studio, and I've got one in my office, and I also have the same exact chairs from Costco that are like $99. Like in the beginning, though, like I was moving my chair back and forth. I was moving the footrest back and forth because like I didn't want to splurge another $140 on the same ergonomic setup that I have in my office in my studio. So I've got the monitor up and down. I have a lam. It's the brand is Lamical, and it's basically like a gooseneck clamp that clamps onto a phone or an iPad or a tablet. And I have it clamped to my desk. Like there's like the legs on my desk, so I don't have anything clamped to the surface of my desk if I could avoid it, because I have minimal desk space in this studio setup. And and then I've been able to position my phone in such a way, because I use continuity camera because I'm all in on the Mac ecosystem, and I discovered my 4K Logitech Brio that I got on sale for like $100. Like even though it's 4K, like the quality was significantly worse than the 1080p output of my iPhone continuity camera, which like you could actually see the color of my eyes, even though it's not 4K. And I looked like completely pale and terrible with the 4K Logitech Brio, but my phone is one of the most expensive things I own, and it has one of the best cameras ever, right? So with the Lamical, I was able to position it right over my ultra wide monitor and set up the monitor. So I'm kind of able to look at the camera, but it's still super unnatural. And I was very dissatisfied with that. So I discovered, and Elgato makes incredible hardware for content creators, lights, cameras, all kinds of things, including in 2024. It might have been late 2023, but I think it was 2024. They released a teleprompter. And this teleprompter makes it so that I could actually have eye contact with the camera and be looking at the video call at the same time. So, like, Lauren, I could be looking in your eyes right now and looking directly into the camera. And for lawyers, I think it's really important that we're making eye contact with the
Yep.
judge, that we're making eye contact with our clients. And so it seems to me like even though we've taken very different approaches to how we're doing that, that ultimately we're trying to do the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's critical. I'm sure we've all been on those calls where someone has got their webcam, like, to the side of them. Have you seen? And then they're, like, crooked and they're typing. So then you're also like, are they even paying attention? Like, why are we having this meeting? But yeah, it feels so disconnected, and I love Zoom, and I love that we're so much virtual, and I think that's one of the best things that came out of COVID, but we also have to be really intentional that it doesn't feel disconnected. Like, we still have to look in the camera and face straight forward as if we were sitting in front of each other, and making sure that you don't need the most fancy, most expensive camera. It sounds like sometimes they're not even that great of quality, that you are just intentional about where is the position of the camera. I wonder if that's even more important than the camera itself.
I think so. Again, you need like bare minimum quality, but if you have a Mac, whether it's a laptop or a desktop, and you have an iPhone, and they're running the most up-to-date software, and they're capable of doing that, your iPhone can be your camera. And then you might think, well, what if I need to look at my iPhone while it's being used as my camera? That's a great reason to get an iPad because then it's like everything on your iPad that you're going to have on your phone. And they sell these, there's multiple different brands, but they sell these MagSafe attachments that attach to your phone and attach to the top of a computer screen, whether that's a laptop or like a an actual like monitor. And there's different versions of it. And Apple has gone so far in on continuity camera that they even sell special ones for if you want to do a FaceTime and then send it up to your TV using Apple TV, so you can see the people on Apple TV, but then position your phone like just below or just above the TV so that it looks like you're having a conversation with them. And if you're watching the video of this, you can see I'm moving up and down. What's cool about continuity camera is, and I wasn't able to do this on my M1 Mac Mini, but I can on my M4 Pro Mac Mini. And so it might be a hardware thing and a software thing. With continuity camera now, you could have all these different virtual backgrounds. So I have set up all these different virtual backgrounds. It's running continuity camera. And what's great about that is it's running natively on the Mac operating system. And so sometimes I used to use OBS. That's more part of the software conversation, but that would interfere sometimes with other software that I was using. And now I could seamlessly move between any video software. And as long as I'm using continuity camera, I could have any of my virtual backgrounds, right? I could switch between my firm one and my podcast one. I have multiple backgrounds that like throw up like different things. So it's not too much on the screen at once, unless somebody wants a QR code to my website or just the URL and the link. So I have that with both the podcast and the firm. And so again, if you're not watching the video, I'm sort of demoing this right now. And this is all in continuity camera. And it's software, but it's specifically related to hardware, right? And then I just have like a generic office looking one because sometimes it's nice to have that. And let's see if I could. I don't really do this a lot, but sometimes I'll just turn it off. And what's cool about continuity camera is even though like my green screen behind me, which is a green screen blanket, which I consider part of the hardware setup,
Yep.
it doesn't go like full left and right. And when I was using OBS, I was able to constrain it so the camera was only focused on the green screen. But thanks to AI and continuity camera, it just sort of extends as long as the subject is within the green, it could just use AI and figure out the rest. And so the tech has come such a long way, and I think you do need a little bit more up-to-date hardware in order to run all of these additional features and continuity camera. And if you don't want a fancy background, they have some great like diffused color palettes of different
Mhm.
backgrounds that you could have. So it's not just one solid color, but there's a little bit of dimension to it.
Right.
And if you ever watch an Apple keynote, they have all of the things from their campus that you could just throw up on your background, and they are super high quality, Lauren. What do you think about how high
I
quality this
love it.
background
I
is?
think that should be your new background. How cheery.
Right? Like this, I think this rainbow is like a real thing on the Apple campus. I think, right? Like so all the Apple stuff, like that you could have all that as your background too. And it's very high quality and it really makes the subject pop the way that they've set it up.
Yeah, it's nice
Uh,
that they have provided ones that work. Sometimes I feel like even the ones that are default I've seen on Zoom, you put them behind you and then it just looks distorted. Like they have obviously thought through what is really going to work for folks on
right.
a video stream. And yeah, they all looked so nice as you were flipping through them. All right, that wraps part one of our conversation about hardware. You may notice I'm wearing a slightly different shirt, and that's because Matthew and I were overzealous thinking that we could cram it all into 1/2 hour episode. We could not. So fear not, we've got you covered. Next episode, we're going to cover part two of hardware. So stay tuned.